German Shepherd went crazy at the abandoned shack. What they found inside was straight up insane. Whether it's a child's laugh or an elder's tears, the loyalty of a dog remains the same. What you are about to hear is more than just a rescue. It's proof that love has no age, no limit, and no end. Like, share, and subscribe to keep these stories alive. The night was still, the kind of silence that makes every creak and whisper echo 100 times louder. A pale moon hung above the small American town, casting silver light over empty streets and the woods that surrounded its edge. At the far end of an old dirt road, half hidden by wild weeds and tangled branches, stood a shack. It had been there for decades, leaning, broken, forgotten. Most folks in town never went near it. Children told ghost stories about it, teenagers dared each other to step inside, and adults shook their heads, saying it was just a rotten place that should have fallen apart long ago. But that night, something stirred within the shadows of its crumbling boards. A sharp bark broke the silence. Then another. A German shepherd stood at the shack's door, teeth bared, his strong body tense as if ready for battle. His paws slammed against the wooden planks, claws digging into the weathered door. Each scratch echoed through the night. His growls rolled low and deep, followed by furious barking that didn't stop. His eyes glowed with intensity in the moonlight, fixed on the dark space between the broken boards. To anyone watching, it was clear he wasn't just barking at shadows. He had found something. One by one, lights flicked on across the town. Curtains pulled back, sleepy faces pressed against windows. Some neighbors stepped onto their porches, crossing their arms against the cold night air, staring toward the noise. "It's just a stray dog," someone muttered. Another shook their head slowly, uneasy. "No, that's old Mr. Miller's shepherd. He's trained. He doesn't act up for no reason." The whispers spread quickly. Dogs don't go crazy at nothing. They sense things we cannot. The shepherd refused to stop. His tail stood rigid, hackles raised. He barked, whined, and threw himself against the door again, as though he knew something, or someone, was trapped behind it. The sound was desperate, not wild. It wasn't the kind of barking that came from fear. It was a call, a warning, a plea for someone to listen. A small group of townsfolk gathered cautiously at a distance. Their flashlights flickered across the weeds, landing on the shack's sagging frame. The air felt colder near the place, as if the shack itself carried a chill that crept into bones. "Why there?" an older woman whispered, clutching her shawl tighter. "That place has been empty since I was a girl." The shepherd's cries grew sharper, echoing through the night, pulling more people from their homes. The longer they watched, the more a strange feeling settled over the crowd. Fear mixed with curiosity, the kind that makes your heart beat faster even when your feet refuse to move closer. Parents held their children back. Teenagers whispered nervously. One man said, "He's acting like something's inside." The idea sent a shiver down every spine. An abandoned shack was supposed to be empty. But what if it wasn't? What if the dog had uncovered a secret hidden for years? The thought hung heavy in the night air. The shepherd barked once more, his voice raw and fierce, and then scratched so hard at the wooden planks that splinters flew. His entire body trembled with urgency. He wasn't giving up. He knew something was in there. And in that moment, everyone watching felt it too. Something about the shack was wrong. Terribly wrong. The whispers died into silence, and all eyes locked on that broken doorway. What lay behind those boards would not just surprise them, it would leave even the bravest souls speechless. The town of Willow Creek was the kind of place where time seemed to move slowly, almost as if the clock itself respected the peace of the people who lived there. Families had known each other for generations, and everyone's life was woven into the fabric of shared stories. On warm summer evenings, old men gathered outside the diner, sipping coffee while they traded tales of the good old days. Women on porches exchanged gossip over fences, and children ran barefoot through yards until the streetlights blinked on. It was a quiet town, safe, predictable, and ordinary. Or at least, that's how it appeared. On the edge of Willow Creek, where the woods grew thick and wild, stood a shack that did not belong to the rhythm of everyday life. Tilted to one side, with boards rotting and the roof caved in, it looked like a skeleton of a house, a reminder of something long forgotten. Its windows were cracked, its door chained once upon a time but now barely holding on, and weeds grew high enough to hide its foundation. Everyone knew it was there, yet everyone acted as though it wasn't. Decades ago, people said a woodcutter had lived in that shack. Some remembered him as a kind man who kept to himself, while others whispered darker things, that he had gone missing under mysterious circumstances and was never found. As years passed, the truth blurred into legend. All that remained was the shack, silent and stubborn, standing against the elements like a ghost that refused to fade away. The children of Willow Creek made it part of their dares. "Bet you can't touch the shack's door," one would shout as the others laughed nervously. Some ran up, smacked the old boards, and bolted back, their screams of fear mixing with laughter. Others refused to get close, their eyes wide with stories they had heard from older siblings. At night, they said, lights flickered through the cracks in the boards, small, dim glows that moved like lanterns in the dark. The bravest kids swore they had heard whispers when they pressed their ears to the wall. The adults dismissed those claims with nervous smiles, yet none of them made an effort to prove the children wrong. Everyone knew stories had power, and sometimes it was easier to let a story live than to test whether it held truth. Quietly, in the safety of their homes, people admitted odd things did happen near the shack. Strange drafts seemed to follow anyone who walked past. The sound of wood creaking often drifted across the empty field, even when no wind stirred the trees. More unsettling, pets avoided it entirely. Cats arched their backs and hissed if carried near the field. Dogs whined, pulled on their leashes, and growled toward the shack's direction, refusing to step closer no matter how much their owners urged. One farmer said his horse reared violently the day he tried to cut across the shack's path, nearly throwing him to the ground. "Animals know," the old folks said with a shake of their heads. "They see what we don't." Despite the unease it caused, the shack became part of the town's rhythm. People got used to avoiding it, as though it wasn't worth the trouble to acknowledge. Teenagers still dared each other to peek inside, but never for long. No one had the courage to spend more than a few seconds near the broken door. It wasn't just the smell of damp wood and mold, or the way the boards seemed to groan under their own weight. It was something else. Something unseen but heavy, as if the shack carried a secret too dark to be uncovered. At the diner, in hushed voices, the old stories resurfaced from time to time. Some claimed they had seen figures standing in the doorway when the moon was full. Others swore they had heard a baby crying in the dead of night, though no child had lived near the shack in generations. "Nonsense," the sheriff always said, shaking his head with the firmness of a man trying to convince himself. "It's just creaks and echoes." But even he admitted he wouldn't walk too close after sundown. So the shack remained what it had always been, a place of whispers, a shadow at the edge of their safe and ordinary world. A reminder that not every story in Willow Creek had a happy ending, and not every corner of the town was touched by peace. But fate has a way of forcing the truth to the surface, no matter how hard people try to bury it. And the day was coming when the forgotten shack would no longer be ignored. Something inside its walls was waiting, and soon it would make itself known. Bruno was not an ordinary dog. He was a strong German shepherd, his black and tan coat gleaming even in the dullest light, and his amber eyes sharp with intelligence. People in Willow Creek knew him as a loyal protector, always walking by his owner's side, always alert, always steady. Children trusted him, farmers admired him, and neighbors often said, "If Bruno is around, you've got nothing to fear." For years, he had been the quiet guardian of the family who owned him, never causing trouble, never giving anyone reason to doubt his discipline. But everything began to change the moment he came near the shack. It was a chilly evening when Bruno's owner, Mark, decided to take him for a walk past the edge of town. The path was familiar: fields, fences, and a curve in the road that led close to the abandoned shack. Bruno had never paid attention to that part of the town before. He usually kept his nose to the ground, sniffing for rabbits or squirrels. But that night, something snapped in him. As they drew near, Bruno stopped in his tracks. His ears shot up, his body stiffened, and a deep growl rumbled from his chest. Mark tugged at the leash. "Come on, boy," he said lightly, thinking it was just a fox or raccoon. But Bruno didn't move. His eyes were fixed on the shack, the fur along his back rising like a warning. Then he barked, loud, fierce, and unrelenting. The sound echoed through the quiet street, bouncing off the old boards of the shack and carrying across the empty fields. At first, Mark laughed. "You're just spooked, Bruno. It's nothing." But the more he tried to pull him away, the more Bruno resisted. His paws dug into the dirt. He lunged forward, straining at the leash as if something inside the shack was calling him. The barking turned to snarls, and his powerful body trembled with intensity. Mark had to grip the leash with both hands just to keep him from breaking free. The noise drew attention. Curtains slid open. Porch lights flicked on. Neighbors peered out into the night, frowning at the sight of the dog going wild at the shack's door. Some shook their heads and muttered, "Crazy mutt." But others whispered uneasily to one another. "Dogs don't act like that without reason," an old woman said, clutching her shawl tighter. "They sense things we cannot." From that night forward, Bruno's behavior grew stranger. Every time Mark walked him near the edge of town, Bruno refused to pass the shack quietly. He would freeze, stare, and then bark furiously at the broken boards as though demanding to be let inside. During the day, he would sometimes slip from Mark's yard, running across town until he reached the shack. Villagers saw him pacing outside, circling the rotten walls, ears pressed forward, his body tense with alertness. No amount of calling or coaxing could pull him away until Mark arrived to drag him home. It wasn't just barking either. Bruno began refusing food on the nights they walked past the shack. He sat by the door, restless, as if waiting for something. His eyes, once calm and steady, now carried an intensity that unsettled even Mark. He scratched at the ground whenever they drew near, his claws tearing at the soil, his nose pressed low, sniffing as though the earth itself was hiding a secret. Mark grew frustrated at first. "You're driving me crazy, boy," he muttered one evening after Bruno had spent nearly an hour growling at the shack. But deep down, he knew this wasn't ordinary stubbornness. Bruno was a smart dog, trained and trusted. If he was reacting this way, there had to be a reason. And that thought unsettled Mark more than he wanted to admit. The whispers in town grew louder. Farmers at the diner leaned across their coffee cups and said, "That shepherd knows something. You mark my words." Mothers walking their children to school kept their distance, pulling them closer when they saw Bruno staring at the shack again. "It's not right," they murmured. "Dogs feel things before we do." Even the sheriff, who prided himself on being a practical man, frowned when he heard about Bruno's antics. "A dog like that doesn't raise hell for no reason," he admitted, though he offered no explanation. At night, the unease spread further. People lying in bed could hear Bruno's barks carrying through the stillness, sharp and echoing, rising from the shack's direction. Some cursed under their breath for the disturbance. Others pulled their blankets tighter, shivering though their windows were shut. The dog's cries were not just loud, they were haunting. They carried something deeper, something raw, as though Bruno was warning them all of a danger they couldn't see. Mark began to notice changes in himself too. Each time he tried to tug Bruno away from the shack, his heart raced faster. He felt eyes on him, though the shack's windows were empty. He told himself it was just the stories he'd grown up hearing, stories of lights and whispers. But now, with Bruno acting this way, those tales no longer felt like harmless gossip. They felt like warnings. One night, Mark tried a test. He brought Bruno down a different road, one that didn't pass the shack at all. Bruno walked calmly, tail swaying, ears relaxed. But the moment Mark steered back toward the shack's side of town, Bruno stiffened again. His head jerked up, his nose lifted to the air, and before long, his barking returned, fierce, unstoppable, as though the shack itself had called his name. By now, the town was divided. Some dismissed the dog as being overprotective or mad. Others leaned heavily into the whispers. "Something's in that shack," they said, "and that shepherd won't rest until we find out what it is." Mark, torn between frustration and fear, could only watch as his once peaceful companion grew more restless with each passing night. It was as though Bruno had found a truth buried in the shadows, and until someone listened, he would never stop. The town had grown used to Bruno's barking by now. Each evening, like clockwork, he would pull his owner toward the edge of town, stop at the old shack, and unleash a storm of howls that carried through the streets. Some villagers rolled their eyes, others shut their windows tighter, but everyone in their own way felt the weight of his cries. One afternoon, when the sky was warm and golden, and children played along the dirt road near the fields, Bruno began again. His sharp barks rattled the air, his claws scraping against the wooden boards of the shack's door. His tail was stiff, his whole body vibrating with urgency. That was when a little girl, no more than 3 years old, wandered closer. Her name was Lily. She wore a simple blue dress, her blonde hair tied with a ribbon that had loosened during her play. In her small hands, she carried a cloth doll with a button missing from its eye. Unlike the adults who crossed the street or whispered nervously whenever Bruno started his ritual, Lily didn't shrink away. She walked forward with the bold curiosity only children have, her tiny shoes crunching against the gravel. "Why is he so loud?" she asked, her voice innocent and light, cutting through the tension like sunlight through clouds. The neighbors nearby turned their heads, uneasy, not knowing how to answer. Her mother rushed forward, holding her by the arm. "Lily, stay back. That dog's not himself," she warned, casting nervous glances at Bruno. But Lily only tilted her head, her big eyes locked on the shepherd. "Why is he sad?" she asked again, clutching her doll tighter. Her words, so pure, made the air heavy. So that was not a word the grown-ups had dared to use. They called Bruno restless, mad, or overprotective. But to a child, his cries weren't madness. They were sorrow. The villagers shifted uncomfortably. They wanted to dismiss the question, laugh it away, but they couldn't. Something in her tone forced them to see Bruno's behavior differently. Bruno, as if hearing her, stopped barking for a brief moment. His amber eyes turned toward Lily, his chest rising and falling with deep breaths. Then, almost as though to answer her, he let out a long, mournful howl that sent chills through everyone's skin. The sound was heavy with grief, a cry that seemed to echo far beyond the shack's walls. "Who's in there?" Lily whispered, her voice trembling now but still curious. "Is he calling someone?" Her mother pulled her closer, but Lily wriggled free just enough to take a small step toward the shack. In her hand, she lifted her doll, holding it out toward Bruno. "Here," she said softly. "This makes me happy. Maybe it will make you happy too." The gesture froze everyone in place. The adults gasped quietly, unsure whether to stop her or to watch. Bruno looked at the small toy, the missing eye, the frayed stitches. His ears twitched, but he didn't move closer. Instead, he barked again, sharp, urgent, and wild, as though rejecting her offer. He wasn't asking for comfort. He was demanding that someone listen. Lily's lip trembled. She lowered the doll slowly, confusion clouding her bright eyes. "He doesn't want it," she murmured. Her tiny voice wavered, and even the hardest-hearted men standing nearby felt their throats tighten. The adults were unsettled. A child had asked the very questions they were too afraid to say aloud. Why was the dog sad? Who was he calling for? They glanced at each other, fear mixing with guilt. No one dared speak the truth forming in their minds. Bruno wasn't going mad, he was guarding something. Lily's father finally stepped forward, scooping her up into his arms. "That's enough," he said firmly, though his voice shook more than he wanted anyone to notice. He pressed her against his chest, but she leaned back to look at the dog once more. "Don't cry, puppy," she called softly, her words carrying over the tense silence. "Someone will listen." Her innocence cut through the heavy air like a knife. For a moment, Bruno's growls quieted, and he lowered his head, as if he understood. Then, with renewed urgency, he threw himself at the door, paws scratching, howling even louder than before. The boards creaked under his weight, and the sound sent a shiver through the crowd. The villagers muttered among themselves. "That child," one old man whispered. "She said what we all feared." Another shook his head. "Dogs don't howl like that unless they know. Unless something's waiting." Bruno's eyes glowed in the fading sunlight, and his cries carried across the field. Lily's toy doll lay in the dirt where she had dropped it, its button eyes staring blankly upward, a quiet reminder of her innocent attempt to soothe a sorrow she couldn't understand. The adults didn't know it yet, but her words had planted a seed. A child's simple question had shaken their doubts more than Bruno's endless barking ever could. For the first time, the whispers carried not just fear, but the beginning of belief. Something was inside that shack. Something that had made a loyal dog restless, and a child curious enough to voice what no one dared. And in that moment, the line between innocence and mystery blurred, pulling the whole town closer to the truth that was waiting to be uncovered. The storm rolled into town like an unwelcome guest. By late evening, the sky had turned heavy and dark, the air thick with the smell of rain. Lightning cracked across the horizon, lighting up the old shack for a split second at a time before plunging it back into shadow. Each flash made its crooked boards and broken roof look more sinister, like a skeleton rattling against the wind. Bruno was already there. His paws were caked with dirt, his fur damp from the first drops of rain. He stood in front of the shack's door, growling low, his eyes locked on the gap between the planks. The storm didn't frighten him. If anything, it seemed to push him harder. He lunged at the door, scratching furiously, his nails leaving long marks on the weathered wood. Every bark he let out was louder than the thunder itself, sharp and desperate, carrying through the entire neighborhood. The townsfolk groaned. Doors opened, windows slid up, and frustrated voices called into the night. "Not again! Somebody chain that dog! He's lost his mind." But those who lived closer, those who could hear his voice clearly, hesitated. There was something different in his barking tonight. It wasn't just noise, it was pain, urgency, even terror. The kind of sound that made the hairs on your arms stand straight. Bruno's owner, Mr. Miller, came running down the muddy path, rain dripping off his hat. "Bruno, enough!" he shouted, grabbing for the leash. But Bruno twisted free, his body shaking with wild energy. He slammed his paws against the door again, howling so long and loud that it almost didn't sound like a dog at all. It sounded like grief. The storm worsened. Wind whipped through the trees, bending branches, scattering loose leaves across the ground. Thunder boomed so close it rattled the windows of nearby homes. And still, Bruno refused to move. His entire body pushed against the shack, as if sheer willpower could tear the door from its frame. Neighbors huddled under their porches, whispering to each other. "He's gone mad." "No, can't you hear it? He's warning us." "Warning us about what?" "It's empty. Always has been." Then came the moment that silenced them all. Between two claps of thunder, when the rain fell in heavy sheets and lightning tore the sky, a faint sound drifted out from the shack. It wasn't the creak of wood. It wasn't the howl of the storm. It was something else. A cry. So, muffled. Every heart froze. People strained their ears, unsure if the storm had tricked them. But Bruno heard it clear as day. His body stiffened, ears sharp, and he barked wildly, throwing himself harder against the door. His tail dropped low, his hackles stood high, and his frantic eyes seemed to scream, "Someone is in there." Mr. Miller staggered back, his face pale. Did you hear that?" he whispered. The neighbors who had mocked the dog a moment ago now looked at each other with wide, unsettled eyes. No one laughed. No one spoke. Another crack of thunder shook the ground, and again the faint sound came, clearer this time. A whimper. A sob. Like a child's voice buried under wood and earth. The storm howled, but it could not cover the sound anymore. People clutched their chests. Mothers pulled their children closer. Men took uneasy steps forward, peering into the darkness of the shack's door. Bruno was no longer just barking. He was pleading. Each cry carried the weight of a desperate message. "There is life here. Help them." The whispers in the crowd turned fearful. "Impossible, no one's in there." Then what did we hear? "God help us. That dog's been right all along." Lightning lit up the scene one more time, Bruno's wet fur standing on end, his paws bloodied from scratching, his mouth open in a furious bark. Behind him, the townsfolk stood frozen, torn between disbelief and the growing horror that something or someone was trapped within that shack. The storm pressed on, but the real storm was in their hearts. The old stories, the ghostly whispers, the endless barking, it all came crashing down into one terrible realization. Bruno hadn't been mad. He had been trying to tell them. And now, on this stormy night, no one could deny it anymore. Something inside that shack was alive, and it was crying to be found. That night, after the storm had shaken every window in town, Bruno still refused to leave the shack. His paws were torn from scratching, his voice nearly broken from hours of howling, yet he stood guard like a soldier who knew his duty. John Miller, his owner, stood nearby soaked to the bone, his hands trembling. He had never seen his dog like this, never seen such desperation. The cries they thought they'd heard earlier still rang in his ears. He couldn't ignore it anymore. With his chest tight, he pulled out his phone and called the sheriff's office. His voice cracked when he explained, but there was no hiding the urgency. Something was inside that shack, and his dog wasn't going to rest until someone listened. The sirens came fast, their wail slicing through the wet night. Red and blue lights flashed across the muddy road as police cars rolled to a stop near the shack. Doors slammed, flashlights clicked on, and uniformed men stepped carefully into the gloom. The townsfolk had gathered too, drawn out of their homes by the storm and the mystery. They stood in clusters, their lanterns glowing like fireflies in the mist, their whispers mixing with the sound of dripping rain. Bruno stiffened the moment the officers approached. His body lowered slightly, his ears pulled back, but his stance was firm. He stood like a guard in front of the shack's warped door, growling low, his chest vibrating with the sound. Every flicker of flashlight, every shuffle of boots, only seemed to make him more protective. To the people watching, it looked as though Bruno was daring anyone to dismiss him now. Sheriff Daniels, a tall man with a heavy brow and a voice that carried authority, pushed forward through the crowd. He squinted at the shack, his flashlight sweeping over the broken boards, the sagging roof, and the door that seemed to tremble with each gust of wind. He frowned and asked the question everyone was thinking. "What's this I hear about voices?" Several people spoke at once. An elderly woman wrapped in a wool shawl raised her hand and said in a thin voice, "I heard it, Sheriff. Not the storm. A cry. A child's cry." A younger man nodded quickly, his face pale. "I heard it too. It was faint, but it was real. Someone's in there." The sheriff turned to look at Bruno. The dog's growl deepened, and then he barked, one sharp, commanding sound that echoed like an order. Daniels had been in law enforcement long enough to know when an animal was reacting to more than shadows. He bent down, shining his light through the cracks in the wood. All he could see was darkness and dust, but the smell that drifted out was sour and wrong, damp earth mixed with something metallic. He leaned back slowly, his jaw set tight. One deputy shifted nervously beside him. "Sheriff, there's nothing in there. Place is rotten. Dog's just spooked." But his words lacked conviction. Even he kept glancing at the door as though expecting it to open on its own. Bruno slammed his paws against the wood again, snarling, his body rigid with determination. Then he looked back at the sheriff, eyes burning in the beam of the flashlight. It wasn't madness, it was a plea. Daniel straightened and gave a long sigh. Dogs don't bark like this for nothing. Not one like him. He raised his voice for the deputies to hear. "We're going to check it out." A ripple of unease moved through the crowd. People clutched each other, their breath clouding in the cold air. For years they had told stories about the shack, rumors of strange lights, of whispers in the night. Most had laughed them off. But now, with the dog refusing to move and the sheriff stepping in, no one was laughing. The deputies circled the shack, shining their lights into the cracks. Dust floated in the beams, but nothing stirred. The windows were sealed shut with years of rot, the glass long gone. The only way in was through the front door. A deputy stepped forward with a crowbar, but Bruno growled sharply, blocking his way. The officer froze, startled by the dog's intensity. But Sheriff Daniels raised a hand. "He's not fighting us. He's telling us to hurry." The officer lowered the tool, waiting for his command. Daniels placed a hand on the warped wood and felt it vibrate faintly beneath his palm. He looked back at the crowd. Faces pale, eyes wide, mothers clutching their children tighter. Then he looked at Bruno, who hadn't moved an inch. The dog's breathing was rough, his fur still wet, but his eyes never left the door. "All right," the sheriff said finally, his voice firm. "Something's in there. Tonight we're going to find out what." The crowd gasped, murmurs rippling like waves. The deputies adjusted their grips on their flashlights and tools, their expressions grim. Bruno sat back just slightly, his tail pressed to the ground, as though he understood that his message had finally been heard. The shack groaned under the weight of the wind, its boards rattling like bones. The uneasy air grew heavier still. This was no longer about a restless dog disturbing the peace. It was about uncovering a truth that had been buried for far too long. The deputies moved closer, their flashlights trembling slightly in their hands. The rain had slowed to a drizzle, but the air was thick and cold, pressing down on everyone gathered there. The shack loomed like a sleeping beast, its broken boards creaking in protest as the wind brushed against them. Sheriff Daniels gave a nod, and two officers stepped forward with a crowbar and heavy flashlight. Bruno immediately leapt to his feet, barking furiously, his body stiff like a drawn bow. He paced back and forth in front of the door, growling as though warning them not to waste another second. "Easy, boy," Daniels muttered, his voice calm but urgent. "We hear you." The first officer wedged the crowbar into the rusted lock. The metal screeched as it bent, the sound grating against everyone's nerves. Sparks of rust and splinters of wood fell to the ground. The shack seemed to groan in resistance, as if it knew its secrets were about to be ripped open. The officer pushed harder, his knuckles white with effort, until the old lock gave way with a snap that echoed like a gunshot. Bruno barked wildly, lunging forward, claws scraping at the dirt as if he wanted to burst through the gap himself. The sheriff pulled him back slightly, but the dog's howls carried into the night, filling every heart with dread. The door creaked open slowly. A wave of air rushed out, stale, cold, and foul. The smell was so strong that several people covered their mouths with their hands. It was damp earth mixed with something sharp, metallic, and sour, like iron left too long in the rain. Lantern light flickered nervously as the townsfolk stepped closer, their faces pale. The officers shone their flashlights into the shack, and for a moment, dust danced in the beams like restless spirits. Inside, the shadows were thick, wrapping around broken furniture and collapsed shelves. A chair lay overturned, one of its legs snapped in half. Old bottles and scraps of paper littered the floor, coated in grime. But it wasn't just the ruin of abandonment that caught their eyes. It was the marks. Deep scratch marks scarred the wooden floorboards, stretching from the far wall toward the door. They weren't the scratches of an animal. They were long, desperate, uneven, made by human hands clawing against the wood. A murmur rippled through the crowd outside, gasps breaking the tense silence. Mothers clutched their children tighter, men exchanged uneasy glances, and Sheriff Daniels' face hardened as he stepped inside. The air grew heavier as the officers moved cautiously forward. Each step on the warped floorboards creaked, echoing too loudly in the small space. Their lights swept over broken planks, then up toward the ceiling where water dripped through holes. And then, at the far corner of the shack, something moved. It was slight, almost hidden by the shadows. A faint shift, like fabric stirring. The officers froze, their beams locking on the corner. The crowd outside grew restless, whispering nervously. "Did you see that?" someone hissed. Bruno went wild. His barks became sharper, faster, as he lunged against his leash. His body trembled with urgency, his eyes never leaving that corner. It was as if he could see through the darkness to what the humans could not yet fully grasp. "Hold your light steady," Sheriff Daniels ordered, his own voice tighter than usual. The beams converged on the corner, chasing away the shadows little by little. And there, half hidden under a pile of broken boards and filthy rags, was a shape. Fragile, trembling. A hush fell over the crowd outside. The deputies stepped closer, their boots crunching on the debris. And then came the sound that confirmed it. A faint whimper, soft and weak, like the cry of someone who had been waiting far too long to be found. One of the officers swore under his breath, his hands shaking. The other whispered, "God Almighty." The sheriff dropped to one knee, shining his light directly onto the figure. Beneath the boards and rags lay a child. Thin, eyes barely open, lips cracked from thirst. The tiny chest rose and fell shallowly, each breath a struggle. Around the child, as if shielding them, a small puppy whimpered weakly, pressing its body close for warmth. The scene stole the breath of everyone watching. Gasps erupted from the crowd, some covering their mouths, others crying out softly. Hardened men who had never shed a tear in public wiped their eyes. Mothers sobbed, holding their children tighter as if to reassure themselves it wasn't theirs under that pile. Bruno barked again, a howl of triumph and urgency, as if declaring, "This is what I was telling you. This is why I never stopped." Sheriff Daniels' voice broke as he called out, "Get the medics! Now!" His deputies rushed forward, lifting debris carefully, their hands trembling with both fear and relief. The child stirred faintly, letting out another weak cry. The puppy licked the child's face gently, its tiny tail flicking with what little strength it had left. The smell of damp earth and despair hung in the air, but something else now rose with it, hope. The crowd outside sobbed and prayed, their lanterns swaying as people held them high to see. They had all thought Bruno was mad, just a dog barking at shadows. Now they saw the truth. He had been guarding life itself. Bruno pressed against the sheriff, whining, his eyes never leaving the child and the puppy. He pawed the ground urgently, urging them to act faster. Daniels placed a hand on his head, his own eyes wet. "You saved them, boy," he whispered. "You saved them." The shack, once a place of fear and gossip, now stood as the setting of a miracle, and the beginning of a night no one in the town would ever forget. The silence inside the shack was crushing, broken only by the shallow breaths of the officers and the steady drip of water leaking through the roof. Their flashlights cut through the dust, beams dancing across rotted beams and broken furniture. The sheriff gestured for the men to sweep wider, his voice low and steady, though it carried an edge of urgency. "Check every corner. Don't miss a thing." The light swept across a broken table collapsed against the far wall. Its legs had snapped, leaving splinters scattered across the floor. Beneath it, half hidden by jagged boards and old cloth, something small stirred. At first, the officers thought it was nothing more than debris shifting in the breeze. But then, a faint sound reached their ears, a whimper. High-pitched, weak, almost too soft to believe. One deputy dropped to his knees, pushing aside the broken wood carefully. His flashlight beam fell directly into the hollow space beneath the table, and his breath caught in his throat. "Sheriff," he whispered hoarsely, "you need to see this." Daniels crouched beside him, eyes narrowing as he followed the light. What came into focus made his chest tighten. A tiny puppy, its fur filthy and patchy, whimpered helplessly, its body trembling with hunger and fear. Its ribs jutted out sharply beneath its skin, and yet, somehow, it had clung to life. "Good Lord," the sheriff muttered, reaching out a cautious hand. The puppy licked weakly at his fingers before curling tighter into itself. The crowd outside could not see, but they sensed something was happening. Their murmurs rose, anxious and sharp. Then came the second revelation. As the officers moved aside more boards, the beam of light revealed another shape, larger, but terrifyingly still. Curled beside the puppy was a child. The girl couldn't have been older than 5, her hair matted with dirt, her face streaked with grime. Her limbs were thin, frail, as though life had been drained from her. She trembled faintly, her chest rising and falling in shallow, labored breaths. The deputy's voice broke. "It's a child. My God, it's a child." The sheriff froze, his hand gripping the flashlight so tightly his knuckles went white. The world seemed to tilt, the sound of the storm outside drowned out by the thunder of his heartbeat. He leaned closer, shining the beam gently across her face, unwilling to believe his own eyes. Her lips were cracked, her eyelids heavy, but when the light touched her, she stirred faintly. A whisper left her throat, a sound so fragile it broke every heart in the room. The reaction outside was immediate. Gasps tore through the crowd as words spread like fire. A child had been found. Mothers cried out, men lowered their heads in disbelief, and the whispers of horror turned into sobs of grief and relief. Lanterns swayed as people tried to see inside, their eyes wide with shock. Hardened farmers, who had seen their share of life's cruelties, wiped at their eyes with trembling hands. Even the deputies, men trained to keep their composure, found themselves blinking back tears. Bruno's bark, which had been sharp, relentless, filled with desperation, fell silent. He stood frozen at the doorway, ears forward, eyes wide. Then, slowly, his growls turned into soft whines. He lowered his body closer to the ground, tail pressed to the dirt, his chest heaving with quiet sobs of recognition. It was as if he had carried the weight of this secret for days, and now that it was revealed, his cries softened into something mournful, almost human. The sheriff reached out to the child, brushing debris from her fragile form. "Stay with us," he whispered, his voice trembling. "We've got you now." The girl's eyelids fluttered, her lips parting to release a faint, broken sound. No words, just the barest hint of life still clinging to her. Outside, the crowd erupted into prayers. Hands clasped together, voices whispered, "Please, God, let her live." Mothers clung to their children tighter, kissing their foreheads as though to remind themselves they were safe. The deputy lifted the puppy gently into his arms, cradling it against his chest. It whimpered again, pressing its nose into his uniform as though seeking warmth. "This little one never left her side," he murmured, shaking his head in disbelief. The sheriff carefully slid his arms beneath the child, lifting her as though she were made of glass. Her head fell weakly against his shoulder, her body light as a feather. He looked toward the door, toward the crowd, his jaw tight, his eyes wet. "Clear the way," he called out, his voice breaking with emotion. "We've got her." The people outside gasped as the sheriff emerged, carrying the child in his arms. The sight stole the breath from every chest. She looked so fragile, so impossibly small, her blue dress torn and dirted, her little hands limp at her sides. The puppy whimpered in the deputy's arms, its small cries echoing hers. Women wept openly, their tears falling freely. Men bowed their heads, some choking back sobs. Even the toughest among them, men who had plowed through storms, buried friends, and faced life's hardships without complaint, found themselves broken in that moment. Bruno followed close behind, his head low, his eyes locked on the child. He whined softly, pressing against her legs as if to assure himself she was real, that she was finally safe. His howling was done. Now he stood as a guardian, his cries replaced by the quiet whimper of loyalty fulfilled. Sheriff Daniels paused in front of the crowd, his voice low but carrying. "This child is alive because of him," he said, nodding toward Bruno. "If not for this dog, we would never have known." The townsfolk bowed their heads in agreement. Some reached out to stroke Bruno's wet fur as he passed, whispering words of gratitude. "Good boy," one said through tears. "You're a good boy." As the child was rushed toward the waiting medics, the crowd parted, their lanterns lighting the path. Hope flickered in every heart, fragile but burning. And Bruno, his duty far from over, followed every step, his soft whines never ceasing, as though promising that he would never leave her side again. The moment the sheriff stepped out of the shack with the frail child in his arms, the night changed. What had once been filled with suspicion and unease now pulsed with urgency and fear. Gasps rippled through the crowd, lanterns lifted higher to catch a glimpse of the tiny figure resting weakly against his chest. The girl's face was streaked with dirt, her hair matted, her lips cracked, her small body barely moving with each shallow breath. She looked like she had been carved from fragility itself, and for an instant, the entire town forgot the storm, the mud, and the rumors. All they saw was a life hanging by a thread. Behind him, one deputy emerged with the whimpering puppy, its body trembling as it pressed into his arms. Its ribs jutted sharply beneath its fur, yet it fought to stay close to the child, its small cries echoing in the heavy air. Together, the sight of the two survivors, the child and the pup, broke the strongest of hearts. Women wept openly, their tears streaking down their cheeks. Men bowed their heads, whispering prayers through clenched jaws. And children clutched their parents tighter, understanding in their innocent way that something miraculous and terrifying had just unfolded. Bruno followed close at their heels, no longer howling or barking, but pacing with frantic energy. His head was low, ears forward, his eyes never leaving the child. He pressed his body against the sheriff's legs as if guiding him, as if making sure not a single step wavered until she was safe. His whines were soft now, almost tender, carrying a depth of emotion that no words could match. The villagers moved quickly, their instincts kicking in. Blankets were rushed forward, some pulled from homes, others from carts. Women spread them on the ground near the waiting lanterns, creating a place for the child to be laid down gently. A farmer offered his thick coat, draping it over her frail frame in hopes of keeping the warmth in. A mother knelt beside her, sobbing quietly, whispering words of comfort though she was not her own. "Doctors!" Sheriff Daniels barked, his voice cutting through the cries. "Where's the doctor?" A figure pushed through the crowd, lantern in hand. Dr. Whitaker, the town's physician, dropped to his knees beside the child, his bag already open. His hands, though steady from years of practice, trembled as he pressed 2 fingers to the girl's neck. For a moment, silence crushed everyone. Then he let out a breath, his voice heavy. "She's alive. Weak, but alive." A collective cry of relief swept through the crowd. Some fell to their knees, thanking God aloud. Others clasped their hands tightly, whispering fervent prayers. Yet the relief was fragile, because the girl's breaths were shallow, her chest rising and falling with agonizing effort. "Get me water," Dr. Whitaker ordered, "and light. More light." Lanterns were rushed closer, their flames flickering against the damp air, casting the scene in a golden glow. Buckets of water appeared from trembling hands. The doctor dabbed her lips gently, coaxing a drop past her cracked mouth. He listened to her chest, shook his head grimly, then looked at the sheriff. "We need to move her. She won't survive here." The medics from the nearest town, who had been called when the police arrived, finally pulled up in their wagon, their uniforms wet from the storm. They rushed forward with a stretcher, their faces tightening when they saw the girl. Without hesitation, they laid her down, covering her with blankets, and began checking her pulse, her breathing, her fragile frame. One of them whispered, "God help her," under his breath before biting it back and continuing his work. The puppy was handed to another medic, who cradled it in his arms, feeding it drops of water from a flask. Its tiny body shivered violently, but it pressed its nose toward the stretcher where the child lay, unwilling to be separated. The medic exchanged a look with the sheriff, then gently placed the puppy on the blanket beside her. The little creature curled immediately against her chest, its small heartbeat thudding faintly against her ribs. The crowd watched in silence, every pair of eyes locked on the fragile scene. Some held lanterns higher, their trembling hands lifting the light as if to fight back the darkness with all they had. Others dropped to their knees in the mud, clasping hands together, their lips moving in prayer. The air was thick with hope and terror, a town bound together by the sight of a child's struggle for life. Bruno whined again, pacing beside the stretcher. He lowered his nose, gently pressing it against the child's dirt-streaked hand. For the first time since the ordeal began, his body relaxed just slightly. He seemed to know she was still here, still fighting, and he refused to let her go alone. The sheriff's voice grew heavy with emotion as he addressed the crowd. This child was dying in there, and we never would have known, if not for him. His hand reached down, pressing firmly against Bruno's wet fur. The dog looked up at him, eyes burning with a loyalty so pure it silenced everyone. "Don't ever forget this," Daniels added. "This dog saved her." The stretcher was lifted, the medics moving carefully toward their wagon. The crowd parted without a word, lanterns lighting the path, their faces wet with tears. Mothers whispered blessings. Men muttered quiet promises that they would never ignore such a cry again. The weight of the moment pressed on every soul. A child's life hung in balance, and a dog had been the only one to hear her call. As the stretcher was loaded, Bruno leapt onto the wagon without hesitation. The sheriff tried to hold him back, but the dog growled softly, refusing to leave the child's side. At last, Daniel shook his head and allowed it. "All right, boy," he murmured. "Stay with her. She needs you." And so the wagon rattled away into the night, carrying a fragile child, a trembling puppy, and the loyal German shepherd who had fought the world to bring them into the light. The town watched until the lanterns faded into the distance, their hearts heavy, their prayers louder than the storm. The wagon thundered through the muddy streets, lantern light swinging wildly as the wheels hit every rut in the road. Inside, the medics worked frantically, their hands steady but their eyes heavy with fear. The child lay bundled in blankets, her face pale under the flickering glow. Each shallow breath she drew seemed like it might be her last. The puppy nestled tightly against her chest, its frail body trembling but unwilling to let her go. And at the edge of the stretcher sat Bruno, pressed so close to her that his fur brushed her tiny hand. Every time the wagon jolted, Bruno shifted his weight carefully, steadying himself so he could keep his nose against the girl's skin. His tongue reached out now and then to lick her hand gently, as though reminding her not to give up. His amber eyes never blinked, never strayed. He was a sentry, and nothing could move him from her side. By the time they reached the hospital, a crowd had already gathered outside, the news having spread like fire through the town. Lanterns lit the night, and whispers of prayer filled the air. Mothers clutched their children close, fathers bowed their heads, and old men leaned on their canes, eyes shining with tears. They all turned as the wagon rolled up to the doors. Doctors rushed out with stretchers, their white coats flapping in the cold wind. They lifted the child carefully, medics calling out her weak pulse, her shallow breaths, her fragile frame. Bruno leapt down with them, his paws splashing into the puddles, and refused to be separated. Nurses tried to hold him back, but he growled low, his body stiff with determination. The sheriff stepped forward and said firmly, "Let him come. He's the reason she's here." So Bruno followed them through the hospital doors, his wet fur leaving streaks on the clean floors. The puppy was carried alongside, bundled in a medic's arms, its whimpers soft but persistent. The girl was rushed into the emergency ward, lanterns replaced by harsh white lights, voices echoing with urgency. Doctors barked orders, nurses hurried with blankets and warm water, and the sound of instruments clattering filled the air. Through it all, Bruno stayed close. He pressed against the bed, his head resting on the mattress, his eyes fixed on the girl's face. Whenever she stirred faintly, his tail gave the smallest wag, but he never once relaxed. His loyalty wrapped around her like a shield, giving strength when none seemed possible. Hours dragged on, and the townsfolk waited outside, whispering their prayers into the night. Some paced back and forth, others knelt in the mud, and still others clung to each other, unable to look away from the glowing hospital windows. Every time a nurse passed through the doors, all eyes turned, desperate for news. Finally, as dawn broke, the sheriff stepped outside, his hat in his hands, his eyes red with exhaustion. The crowd surged toward him, their voices trembling. "Is she alive? Did she make it? Tell us, Sheriff." He lifted his hand for silence. His voice cracked but carried strong. "She's alive. Weak, but alive. And so is the pup." The crowd erupted in tears and cries of relief. Mothers hugged their children tightly, men embraced one another, and old women crossed themselves, whispering blessings. Lanterns swayed as people raised them high, a symbol of hope finally answered. Inside, the doctors marveled at what they called a miracle. The child, though malnourished and broken in spirit, had clung to life with unimaginable strength. The puppy, frail and hungry, had kept her company through the darkness, its body a small comfort against loneliness. But above all, they said, it was the German shepherd who had saved her. Without Bruno's relentless howling, without his refusal to give up, she would have been lost forever. The sheriff himself admitted it openly to the townsfolk. "If not for this dog," he said, his hand pressed firmly to Bruno's head, "we never would have checked that shack. We would have walked away. She's alive because of him." The crowd cheered, tears mixing with laughter, their voices rising like a hymn. Bruno, standing tall beside the sheriff, did not seek attention. His eyes never left the hospital bed where the girl lay resting. He only whined softly when she shifted, his heart tethered to hers as if they were bound for life. Days passed, and the girl began to recover. Color returned to her cheeks, her breaths grew steadier, and her small hands finally gripped the blanket with strength. The puppy, too, gained strength, wagging its tail weakly whenever the girl stroked its fur. And through it all, Bruno stayed close, by the bed at night, at the hospital door by day, his loyalty unshaken. Soon, word spread far beyond the town. Newspapers called it the miracle at the shack. Reporters wrote about the dog who refused to stop barking until life was found. Strangers sent letters, praising Bruno as a hero. But for the townsfolk, no words could capture it. They had seen it with their own eyes. They had heard his cries in the night. They had witnessed the miracle born of loyalty. For them, Bruno was no longer just a German shepherd. He was a guardian, a savior, a symbol of love so pure it had pierced the darkest corners of despair. And as the little girl finally opened her eyes fully, whispering her first word in days, "Doggy," the room filled with tears and laughter alike. Bruno wagged his tail gently, his eyes soft as if to say, "I told you. I knew she was there. And I will never leave her again." The town that once looked at the abandoned shack with fear and disgust began to see it differently. For years, people had crossed the dirt path quickly, whispering about strange noises, warning their children never to wander too close. But now, when folks passed by, they slowed their steps. Some even stopped. The broken boards and rusted hinges no longer stood for mystery and fear. They stood for survival. They stood for the miracle that a dog's instincts had uncovered when human eyes and reason had failed. Neighbors brought fresh flowers and left them at the edge of the shack. Others placed candles in old jars, their flickering light glowing against the weathered wood. It was no longer a place to avoid. It had become a place to remember. At the center of this transformation stood Bruno. Once just a loyal dog known to the locals, he had now become the very heartbeat of the town. Wherever he walked, people stopped to pat his head or whisper thanks. Children who once hid behind their mothers now ran to him with open arms. Bruno accepted it all quietly, never straying far from the little girl he had saved. The child, though still recovering, carried herself with a new light in her eyes. The town doctor said it would take time for her body to heal from malnutrition, but her spirit seemed to mend faster every day. Much of that was because of Bruno. He refused to leave her side, curling beside her bed at night, following her every step during the day, and placing his head gently in her lap whenever she felt weak. One morning, as the sun spilled golden light across the rooftops, the girl in her little blue dress walked through the town square holding Bruno's leash. The townsfolk gathered silently, watching as she bent down and pressed her face against the shepherd's fur. "This is my dog," she said softly, her voice still fragile but full of certainty. And in that moment, everyone knew it was true. Bruno had chosen her, and she had chosen him. For the sheriff, the memory of that stormy night would never fade. He often replayed the moment he first arrived at the shack, skeptical, shining his flashlight into the shadows. He remembered dismissing the noise, almost turning away. And then he remembered Bruno, standing there like a soldier, refusing to let anyone walk past, his growls fierce and his eyes full of urgency. "We would have missed her," the sheriff admitted more than once, his voice breaking. "We would have walked away and she would have been lost. That dog saved her life." The town elders reflected quietly too. They had lived long enough to see their share of tragedies, and many of them admitted that if not for the dog, they never would have believed there was life inside the shack. Sometimes, one old man said from his porch, we put too much faith in reason. Dogs, animals, they feel what we cannot. They remind us there is more to this world than what we see. The story spread beyond the borders of the small town. Reporters came eager for headlines. They snapped pictures of the girl in her blue dress and the big German shepherd sitting loyally by her side. They wrote articles calling Bruno the miracle dog. Yet for the people who had been there that night, it was more than a headline. It was a reminder that miracles often hide in the most forgotten places, in broken shacks, in faint cries, in the loyalty of a dog who refused to give up. The child's bond with Bruno only grew stronger as the weeks passed. She began to smile again, her laughter ringing through the streets. At times, she would curl up beside him on the grass, whispering secrets into his ear as though he were the only one who could understand. Bruno would wag his tail gently, pressing closer, his eyes half closed with peace. It was as if the two of them had built their own language, one of loyalty, one of trust. For the townsfolk, this bond became a lesson. They realized that sometimes the greatest truths aren't uncovered by logic or reason, but by the purest instincts of the heart. Bruno hadn't needed proof, hadn't needed evidence. He had only needed to follow the pull inside him that told him life was hidden where others saw nothing. His loyalty, his persistence, had uncovered what reason alone could not. One evening, as the townsfolk gathered for a small vigil near the shack, the mayor spoke with a trembling voice. "We feared this place for too long," he said, lantern light flickering against his weathered face. "We thought it was cursed. But it wasn't the shack that was dangerous. It was our own blindness. We didn't see. We didn't listen. But one dog did, and because of him, we have hope again." The crowd nodded, tears glistening in many eyes. Mothers held their children tighter, fathers bowed their heads in gratitude. The shack, once a shadow on the edge of town, now stood as a symbol, not of fear, but of survival, of love, of second chances. The little girl placed her tiny hand on Bruno's head that night, her blue dress swaying gently in the evening breeze. She whispered softly, "Thank you," and though no one else heard it, everyone could feel its weight. For in that quiet thank you was an entire town's gratitude, wrapped in the innocence of a child who had been given back her life. Bruno, the once restless shepherd, now walked with calm pride. He had fulfilled a purpose that no one else could have. He had reminded the world that loyalty and love shine brightest in the darkest corners. And as the town moved forward, they carried that lesson with them. Sometimes, it isn't the strongest or the smartest who uncover the truth. It's the purest heart, the one that refuses to give up. This was not just the story of a rescue. It was not just about an abandoned shack or a forgotten corner of town. It was about loyalty, about love, and about how light can shine even in the darkest places. One German shepherd refused to give up, refused to stay silent, and because of his persistence, a life was saved. Bruno reminded everyone that sometimes the purest hearts see what our human eyes cannot. When we think of miracles, we often imagine grand events, flashes of lightning or voices from the heavens. But miracles are sometimes quiet. Sometimes they wear fur, have gentle eyes, and speak only through barks and howls. Bruno was no ordinary dog. He was a messenger, a protector, a symbol of what loyalty truly means. The shack that once cast shadows of fear now glows in memory as a place of survival. And the child who once trembled in darkness now walks in the sunshine, holding the paw of her loyal friend. Together, they are living proof that love refuses to surrender, even when the world seems lost. Now, dear listener, I want to ask you something directly. Do you believe that animals sense things we cannot? Do you believe they carry gifts beyond logic? Gifts of instinct, of faith, of love that does not waver? Think of your own life. Maybe you've had a dog who refused to leave your side on a hard day, or a pet who seemed to know your pain without you saying a word. Perhaps you've witnessed an animal show bravery when humans hesitated. These moments are not accidents. They are reminders that love is not limited to our kind. It runs deeper, wider, beyond reason. Bruno's story is more than an event in one small town. It is a call to open our hearts and listen more closely, not just with our ears, but with our souls. It is a reminder that kindness, no matter how small, can change everything. That sometimes the most unexpected voices, the bark of a dog, the innocence of a child, are the ones that guide us to truths we would never find on our own. If this story touched your heart, I ask you to share it. Share it with someone who still believes in kindness, or with someone who has forgotten what kindness feels like. Share it with a friend who needs hope, or a neighbor who could use a reminder that miracles still exist. Because stories like this aren't just meant to be heard, they are meant to be carried, passed on, kept alive. Tonight, as you turn off the lights and settle into your own quiet corner of the world, remember Bruno. Remember the shack. Remember that one dog's loyalty brought an entire town to its knees in awe and gave a little girl a second chance at life. And remember this simple truth: love, loyalty, and innocence will always shine brighter than fear.